You've seen the gimmick, maybe even 2 decades ago. But how much do you know about the winners of NWA TNA's first official match? Introducing the Flying Elvises. On June 19, 2002, NWA TNA's first ever event on pay-per-view, the show opened with a card reshuffle, as a parade of NWA legends were highlighted. This is because in what would become a trend for TNA, a crisis had to be averted. In a pre-show match, a wrestler known as Cheeks actually broke the ring. As the event opened, you can actually see the Harris twins among others just about completing the repairs. Had this not occurred, it's likely that the first segment of NWA Total Non-Stop Action would have been the following match featuring 3 wrestlers I'm about to tell you about, as former ECW World Champion Jerry Lynn teamed with Low Key and a rookie AJ Styles to face the Flying Elvises. In the early days of TNA, there were many characters that were clearly written to cater to the most stereotypical of Southern audiences. It's almost like a New Yorker had his pen on the paper, and much of it would not be okay today, bro. You had the heel portrayal of the Rainbow Express, a clearly gay tag team drawing the cheapest of cheap heat. On the other side of the coin you had Cowboy James Storm firing off cap guns, and even an appearance by Toby Keith, who was plugging his song courtesy of the Red, White and Blue, which admittedly I kinda liked back then, but the older I get it just sounds silly enough to be in Team America World Police. Getting back to the Flying Elvis gimmick, Jeff Jarrett on My World openly admitted that it was created to resonate with the Alabama crowd, which in itself is not a bad thing, but you also have to think about the national pay-per-view audience you're trying to draw. Despite the silliness of the gimmick, let's look at the 3 men in the role, who they were, and what happened to them. This video isn't going to be about their runs as the Flying Elvises, more their entire in-ring careers. Let's start with maybe the most successful of the 3, Jimmy Yang, real name James Carlson Yun. Jimmy was born in California to a German mother and a Korean father, but was raised in Georgia. In a 2006 interview with GoWet.net, Jimmy confirmed this, and I defy you to find a more mixed heritage wrestler than that. Jimmy trained to wrestle at the WCW Power Plant, the most famous graduates of which include the Natural Born Thrillers, and a while before that, Bill Goldberg. In an interview when asked to comment on his time at the WCW Power Plant, Yang described it as hell, and the hardest thing he's ever been through. Jimmy would graduate to the WCW roster in early 2000 and would quickly be placed in the gimmick he would keep till the company's end. He would be part of a martial arts inspired trio known as the Young Dragons, going by the name Yang. His teammates in the group would be Japanese born cruiserweight Kaz Hayashi and strangely West Virginia born masked wrestler Jamie-san. Jamie would later be known to some under his real name as former Ring of Honor World Champion James Gibson. Actually, the man who beat CM Punk for that title, but most likely remember him as former WWE Cruiserweight Champion Jamie Noble. It was a WCW gimmick in 2000. Of course it had to turn weird somehow. The Young Dragons were often the highlight of the opening matches of the latter days of WCW, especially when feuding with fellow Cruiserweight trio 3 Count. Their most famous match, and possibly their most popular one, was possibly their Trios ladder match against 3 Count, which some consider to be the lone highlight of Starrcade 2000. When WWE acquired WCW, Yang's was one of the many contracts the Fed picked up, but Yang would be sent to train at Les Thatcher's Heartland Wrestling Association, one of their developmental territories at the time. Unfortunately, Jimmy would be released before actually wrestling for WWE. According to Jimmy Yang himself in a 2022 shoot interview, the idea for the Elvis gimmick came from Vince Russo, Triple H and Shawn Michaels, which implies that this was first pitched in WWF, as Yang was in WCW while Shawn, Hunter and Russo were still in New York. Yang claims Vince McMahon shot the idea down, but when Russo went to TNA, the idea was allowed to thrive. When Jimmy was presented with the Flying Elvis costume, in his own words, he left the room refusing to wear it on national television. Eventually though, he conceded, and grew to have fun with the gimmick. Post-WCW, Yang would be signed to WWE in 2003, and would appear as Akio, a Yakuza-style henchman for Tajiri on SmackDown, teaming with Ryan Sakoda. Yang claims that the name Akio was pitched by a WWE writer who looked in a Japanese phone book for a name and thought Akio was, quote, the coolest one he found. Yang would be released in July of 2005, but less than a year later, after a run in Ring of Honor, he would be rehired by WWE, playing a vastly different character. After working a tryout match as Akio and impressing WWE management, he would soon be repackaged as Jimmy Wang Yang. The character was based on Yang's Georgia upbringing, despite his Korean heritage, and the conflicting perception people had of him. Yang was a popular but fairly low-card act until his second release in 2010. Despite Jimmy being a fixture in 2 major promotions, I couldn't find any evidence of him winning a championship anywhere. He did, however, win 2 tournaments in All Japan Pro Wrestling. Nowadays, Jimmy seems to have left the wrestling business full-time, but he still wrestles occasionally. At the time of me making this video, for his last match, he bizarrely popped up on a recent Pro Wrestling Noah event, losing a 6-man tag alongside fellow WWE Cruiserweight Super Crazy. Jimmy currently has a full-time job as well as wrestling, where he owns and operates a camouflage-clad redneck party bus, and a pink princess party bus based in Ohio, which it's safe to say is one of the more out-there transitions out of the ring. Meanwhile, Jimmy's daughter has begun her wrestling career. Jazzy Yang has around 30 matches under her belt, the most high-profile being at NWA Empower, teaming with 2 other second-generation wrestlers. Firstly, Hollywood Haley J, who competes mainly in WOW, and Miranda Gordy, the daughter of another wrestling veteran, Terry Gordy. Maybe Jazzy will be able to avenge her father by winning some championship gold. Next, we have the Flying Elvis, who was thought to have the most promise, Sonny Siaki. Sonny was born in Hawaii before moving to California and settling in North Carolina. He was apparently a school friend of WCW wrestler Lodi, who advised him to try out for the power plant, to which he was accepted. His training is credited to WWE Hall of Famer Mr. Wonderful Paul Orndorff. Sonny would wrestle on WCW Worldwide and Saturday Night, even earning some wins, but would never wrestle on Nitro or Thunder. He would last wrestle for WCW in March of 2000, and would quit the company not long before its closure, not liking how he was being booked. From here, Sonny would work independence, and would be booked by Dusty Rhodes' Turnbuckle Championship Wrestling, receiving further training from Dusty along the way. When NWA TNA started, Sonny was a day one hire. According to Jeff Jarrett, there were several promotions that TNA looked at when assembling their roster, such as Georgia-based NWA Wildside, where they found future world champions Ron Killings, now R-Truth, and AJ Styles. It's very likely that Turnbuckle Championship Wrestling was another of these promotions that they had an eye on. Following his time as a Flying Elvis, Sonny would stay with TNA, as they considered him a future prospect. Back then, fans used to compare him to The Rock, based on his general look and charisma. Does that sound familiar? Sonny's career highlight may have been the December 11, 2002 TNA pay-per-view, where he would defeat Jerry Lynn for the X Division Championship. Sonny would hold the title for about 60 days, before losing it to Kid Cash. One of Siaki's last notable matches came at the first TNA Lockdown event, on April 24, 2005, where he and Apollo would face Lance Hoyt, now Lance Archer, and Chris Candido. This would be the match where Candido would suffer from a blood clot that would eventually cost him his life. In early 2006, Sonny would be signed to a WWE developmental contract. He would work for Deep South Wrestling, one of WWE's developmental territories, before being moved to FCW when the Deep South relationship ended. In 2007, he would wrestle on 2 main roster house show tours, one for the Raw brand in February and a second in June for SmackDown, but he would never wrestle a televised match for WWE. In September 2007, he would be released from his contract, and a few days later he would publicly comment that he had some personal family issues to deal with, and he was putting those first. In a 2013 interview with the Wrestling Epicenter podcast, Sonny elaborated that those issues pertained to an ill family member. It's not my place to go into details more than that, but I'll include the link of him talking about it in the description. Sonny would continue to wrestle on the independent scene, presumably having far more control than the WWE schedule would allow, but would have his last match in 2009 for Georgia-based NWA Primetime. What's sad in a way about Sonny's career is that many had high hopes for him, but ultimately he stepped away from the ring for selfless reasons, and that ought to be admired.
Elvis has left the building. Oh, yeah.
Unfortunately, the third Elvis had the least of a wrestling career, Jorge Estrada. Born Jorge Maraza in Miami, Florida, he would be trained in 1999 by Dusty Rhodes, and like Sonny Siaki, he would wrestle for Dusty's Turnbuckle Championship Wrestling, which like Siaki was his path to NWA TNA. In his time in TNA, Jorge wrestled 26 matches, even challenging for the X Division title once in a losing effort to Low-Ki. Jorge would leave TNA in March of 2003, and his final match there would be a victory over a villainous Elvis character called Disgraceland. Yep, TNA had a fourth Elvis. Don't tell me you don't learn anything on this channel. There were even technically 3 more Elvises in a weird period for Jeff Jarrett, Scott Hall and Kevin Nash later on. Late into the making of this video, I also discovered something I'd long forgotten, and that's that while still playing Elvis, Jorge briefly had a valet named Priscilla. Clearly named after Elvis's ex-wife, but also, as I know her better, star of the Naked Gun movies. According to her IMDb page, Priscilla, real name Jody Horn, got into wrestling after meeting Jerry Lawler backstage at a show, and asking to be his valet. She was part of TNA from their first event, where she was introduced as Miss Joni, one of many women who competed in a lingerie battle royal. After briefly managing Jorge and leaving him for Brian Christopher in November 2002, she seems to have left the wrestling business as best I can tell. Around this time, Jorge seemed to stop wrestling altogether, and there's not a lot of information out there as to what he's doing today. In the Jimmy Yang interview I mentioned earlier from 2006, Yang noted that he hadn't heard from Estrada in a long time, and also implied that Jorge was in trouble with the law, but didn't elaborate any further. It seems as though Estrada achieved some high regard in his time in the ring though, as in 2003 he achieved number 182 in the PWI 500. To put this in a modern context, had he placed there this year, he would have been ranked between Dax Harwood and Tyler Bate, who are each fairly well respected in their own rights. I know this isn't exactly a fair comparison given how much wrestling has changed over the past 20 years, but that's still an impressive number, and even more so when Jimmy Yang didn't even make the list in the same year. So why all these years later are the Flying Elvises still remembered? It feels like an act that should have fallen by the wayside years ago, yet people still talk about the trio of Elvis impersonators in the early days of TNA. Part of it has to be the sheer gall of TNA to put them over 2 wrestlers who had become the first X Division and Tag Team Champions for the promotion, as well as the current and first ever Ring of Honor World Champion, and part of it has to be the sheer weirdness of a Korean from Georgia, a Hawaiian and a Floridian playing the King of Rock and Roll. That'll stick in the memory like a Japanese woman playing Freddie Mercury, or an American suddenly and for no reason playing Elton John. Oh wait, those are real too. I guess my point is, given how I've been fairly critical of Vince Russo on this channel, fair play to him for creating a gimmick that is for once not remembered for reasons that would get him cancelled if he tried it today. Yes, I'm looking at you, the Johnsons. Thank you for watching yet another wrestling channel. If you enjoyed this, please comment, like or subscribe.